Hi, this is the second in a series of conversations, very informal, that we're planning to have around objects in the Timken's collection. And today I want to talk about something that's probably not unique to the Timken. In fact, I've never worked in a museum that doesn't have some version of this problem. And museums that collect things sometimes have very big collections, oftentimes run across objects that they really are at a loss to explain how they got to be there. And I thought I'd share one of those instances with you and some research we've been doing to try to clarify the history of a small painting that's in the collection. So this is the object in question. It's a very modest painting. So let's start with that. Maybe 11 inches wide and about 8 inches tall. It's unsigned. There's practically speaking no information on the back of the painting. There's a manufacturer's stamp on the stretcher bar, and that's it. And it didn't have a frame around it when we discovered it in the vaults. And so it's a work of art that I've been asking questions about for, well, as long as I've been working with the Timken for the last few years. And finally, I had a breakthrough, which I wanted to share with you. But the story of this painting actually traces back to the very beginnings of the institution. And most people who know the Timken know something about the story of the Putnam Sisters, Anne, Irene, and Amy Putnam, who moved to San Diego in the early 20th century, who were great philanthropists supporting a variety of institutions and causes with the wealth that they inherited. None of them married. There's so three single women with tremendous economic power and freedom to do what they wanted. And this painting actually goes back to them in a way that I want to explain. This is a photograph of the Putnam Sisters, a tintype actually of them, probably taken in Bennington, Vermont, where they lived before they moved to San Diego at the turn of the century. And Bennington was a community that knew the Putnams well. The Putnams played a big role in the sponsoring of public institutions there, at least two public libraries, a hospital. There's a street in Bennington named after the Putnam family. And this tintype shows them relaxing in that space, which they knew well and contributed so much to. I think it's probably Amy, the youngest, sitting on the ground, and I can't quite identify the other two sisters from this view of them, but certainly them looking out over this space and contemplating their futures. By the time they came to San Diego, they were already adults. I'm showing you a photograph of Amy, probably around the time she was 25 or 26, a photograph taken in New York City. But by 1914, they had moved into the grand mansion at 4th and Walnut Streets that they had built for themselves, and where they lived in fairly complete or isolation, I should say, not anonymity, because most people knew who they were, but not a lot of social exchange. They had this very private existence, and it's been said many times that very few people really knew who the Putnams were, but they, as we know at the Timken, played a huge role in determining the culture of the city of San Diego, and I'm excited to have them as really pioneers of the museum, but also these really special women who understood the value of art in a community. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about them, especially about Amy. They were all extremely well educated, literate women. Irene wrote poetry and spoke French, but Amy was maybe the most actively and passionately engaged with the formation of art collections, which they first gave to the San Diego Museum of Art and then began to collect in order to create the Timken, which did not open until after their deaths. In 1936, the middle sister, Irene, passed away, and one of the ways that her older and younger sisters, Anne and Amy, decided to recognize her was by giving a work of art in her memory to the San Diego Museum of Art. So I'm showing you the fragment of an altarpiece by Giotto, which bears a credit line from the Putnam Sisters in memory of Irene, and they gave this work to Reginald Poland, who I'm also showing you here on this slide. Poland was lucky enough to be the first director of the San San Diego Museum of Art, and must have felt like he was really lucky to have sponsors like the Putnam Sisters to count on to help him build what became one of the finest collections of European painting on the West Coast. And this is an index of that. So this is the kind of thing that the Putnams wanted to do without any kind of fanfare, did not want to be publicly recognized. In fact, for a long time, works that they gave to the San Diego Museum of Art didn't have a credit line that identified them. They were just given anonymously, and only a few people knew that the source of this philanthropy was Anne and Amy Putnam. Meanwhile, as we know, they were also building a collection which would become the basis for the Timken Art Gallery's collection, now the Timken Museum of Art's collection. So in 1951, they were buying paintings like this monumental altarpiece, The Death of the Virgin by Petrus Christus, and all the while making plans to open their own museum, or a museum that they would be the primary sponsors of the art collections anyway, in the latter part of the 20th century. So that's how they were spending their time. But we actually know that public piece of their lives fairly well. We know less about the interior lives and what took place in that grand house on 4th and Walnut Streets in San Diego. We do know that Amy collected for herself not old master paintings, but Russian icons. She had actually studied Russian at Stanford University and taught herself to read the Russian language. So she was reading Tolstoy and other authors in the original text that they wrote, and the original language that they wrote in, and she was surrounding herself with these Russian icons. At one point, she had over 300 of them in her rooms at her home, and some of these are now on display at the Timken. In fact, I've long been interested in the Room of Russian Icons because I felt like it so closely approximates really what the Putnam Sisters, specifically Amy, were interested in their private lives, to the degree that they even picked the flocked wallpaper that now is on the walls of that space. It was their choice to have that kind of presentation of the works. And in that way, I think it suggests something of how they thought about art in their daily lives, even as they were building these important public collections for the people of San Diego. And that brings us to this curious little painting, which, as I said, was presented to me early on. Early on my time at the Timken as a kind of problem picture. It was in the vault. There aren't many pictures in the vault in storage at the Timken. Most of the paintings are on the wall, and they're mostly Russian icons, again, from Amy Putnam's collection that just isn't space to hang them in the Russian gallery. But there was this one little painting, and I didn't quite know what to make it because I studied American art myself. I recognized it pretty quickly as a mid-19th century depiction of an iron forge, but unsigned, as I said. Not a particularly great painting, so I was not a huge fan of it to begin with, and I actually asked one of our interns, Veronica Bellacci, to do some research on the painting, and she studied it for quite a while, chased down all sorts of leads, and she felt like it could be a work by someone like John Ferguson Weir, who did these monumental paintings of forges right around the time of the Civil War. And so I'm showing you two of those, a gun foundry and Forging the Staff, these big dramatic pictures about the power of industry at a time when it was brought to bear on the war effort. And, I doubted that it was by John Ferguson Weir. I've looked at a lot of his paintings and didn't think it had the particularity or the sort of sophistication of his compositions, but I was interested and certainly thought it could be by an artist who had seen these works or knew about similar works. And in fact, there are just a lot of paintings of ironworks in the 19th century. It was, as I said before, a new industry and something that captivated the attention of the public as well as artists within that public. And so you see lots of examples at the Musée d'Orsay or at the Staatsmuseum für Kunst in Copenhagen, in England. There are lots of images of pouring steel, forging iron. Those are big themes for artists at this time. And so it shouldn't surprise us that a smaller scene like this might be produced by an artist whose name we don't know any longer. And so I was interested in the family of pictures to which our little unknown picture belonged to. And then just completely by surprise, and very recently, I was reading through some family letters in the archives that the Timken has about the Putnam sisters. And there are a lot of letters, I should say, because they were single women, and some of these letters were written toward the end of their lives. A lot of letters from people they did not know, but who were claiming to be relatives of theirs in hopes of maybe claiming some part of their inheritance when these women died. And so some of the letters are really amusing from people who may or may not be Putnam relatives. But one caught my eye and was from someone who seemed to actually know the family well. And one of the questions that just leaped out at me from the page as I was reading it, it asked, it was a letter to Anne, it asked if the family still had the painting of Putnam Forge in its collection, that she remembered it. And so I was all of a sudden alert to the fact that maybe this is the painting that the letter writer refers to, and certainly it explained why a painting like this might be in the vaults of the Timken. And so I did a little further research. I had not heard that part of the family history. And in fact, when we think about the Putnams, we think about them from Bennington, Vermont. But this letter referenced a forge, a Putnam forge that was in New York State. And indeed, there was an important forge in the Adirondacks. There were numerous iron forges throughout the 19th century, and I was able to uncover some documentary evidence that suggested that one of them belonged to Misters Albert and Henry Putnam. So the Putnam's father and uncle, respectively, which contained 4 fires and a wooden hammer of about 1,800 pounds weight. And that's what we see in this painting at the Timken, this large hammer that would have been used to take the molten iron ore and pound it into what were called pigs, these large blocks of metal material that could then be turned into many things, including nails, which was one of the things that the Putnam family made its fortune producing, were these tacks that would have been a kind of precursor to staples in construction projects. So it seemed more and more likely to me that the painting that we had found in the vault, minus its frame, was actually one of the things that the Putnam sisters took with them from their home in the East to California, that along the way it would make sense that it ended up at the Timken's vault, but we had no acquisitions records for it, nothing. But I think it's still interesting that it gives us this clear view of the kinds of objects that the Putnams wanted to keep close to them, their attachments to their life back in both Vermont and New York State, and their real appreciation for art, whether it was by Giotto or by Bruegel or by some minor 19th century, probably New York painter whose identity we still have to discover, but we're a lot closer to learning that information. And I'm really happy to share it with you. So I'll see you soon. Stay healthy and stay safe. Thanks.